Hello, you have now bared with me through going on our third video on Kantian ethics. What we're going to do this time is first go over the Maxim identification worksheet that I wanted to use to practice applying the first formulation of the categorical imperative, and then we'll move on from that and spend the majority of our time in this video looking at the second formulation of the categorical imperative. We'll wrap up by talking about all the steps you would need to make sure you went through in order to apply Kantian ethics to a case, like you're going to do on your essay. So let's look at the Maxim identification and review what you did there. So by the time you get to this, you should have looked at that worksheet already and made some attempt to identify what, for each example there, that individual's maxim would be, and whether you think that it's something that can be done if everyone else is doing it at the same time, and whether it's something that we would want to be made a universal practice. So let's take Patrick. Patrick's parties every Thursday night and skips his 9 a.m. class every Friday morning. So he's definitely making a rule for himself by partying and not going to class. So there are a lot of ways that you could probably define this maxim. There's not one right answer, but I decided to define it this way, that I can prioritize partying over going to class. You could also have articulated it as it's okay to skip class because I partied, or I don't need to go to class, or something along those lines. And then our question is going to be, can he do this if everyone else is doing it at the same time? It is possible to do, right? There's nothing that if everyone else prioritizes partying over going to class, there's nothing preventing Patrick from doing that. So it's not logically impossible for him to do it while everyone else is doing it. But we probably don't want a world in which everyone does that. It might not be the type of world we want to live in. We need some people to go to class, to gain knowledge, and not to party all the time. To go on to the second example of Brittany, Brittany is the one who's considering copying her classmates' answers on her philosophy exam. I kind of gave this one away in the last lecture when we talked about cheating. Her maxim is probably pretty straightforward. I can copy my classmates' exam in order to pass. Like we saw with cheating, this actually becomes impossible for Brittany to do if everybody does it too, so we know that she has a perfect duty never to cheat off her classmate. Carl's maxim, he's the one who wants to fudge his parents' data on the financial aid form in order to get more aid. This might be something like, I can misrepresent my financial information to get more aid. So this sounds like lying, right? Misrepresentation is a form of lying. We already know that Kant does not appreciate lying. This is one of those things that Carl will only be successful with if everyone else is being truthful on their financial aid form. So the idea here is that Carl wants to be believed. He wants the financial aid reviewers to think that the information that he has presented is truthful and correct. That's only possible. They're only going to think that if that's how most people are. If most people do present true information, then Carl's false information is likely to be believed, since most information that they get is true. But if it was universally practiced that everyone lied on these forms, then Carl's information will be assumed to be false as well. So this is another example of a practice of a maxim that is not universalizable, because if he does it and everyone else does it too, then he's actually not going to be able to do it himself. So in this case, we have a perfect duty not to misrepresent financial information on his form. And then lastly, we have Diana. She's the one who doesn't feel like giving other people a ride home, even though she could do that. So her maxim is probably, I can decline to help others for my own convenience. There's nothing prohibiting her from doing that if everyone else acted the same way. But this is kind of like Kant's example in the text of giving to charity, where we can see that we wouldn't want a world in which everybody was more worried about their own convenience than they were about helping others. So we would probably say that Diana has an imperfect duty to give some people rides sometimes. Okay, so let's move on from this to look at the second version of the categorical imperative. So when you're applying Kantian ethics to a case, you need to make sure you apply both versions. The first one where you identify the maxim and decide whether it's universalizable, and also this second one that we're dealing with now, which has to do more directly with how we are to regard and treat other people. So the way Kant phrases it is that we should so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. So this is another example of Kantian language being difficult to decipher, and there are some terms we're going to need to define here. So when we're talking about using a person as a means, A means is like a tool or an instrument, something you use to achieve something else. So something that we regard as a means is only valuable to the extent that we can use it to achieve this goal or purpose. Whereas an end is something that we value for its own sake, or we say that it has inherent value. So to go back to what Kant is saying here, he's saying that we should regard all other people, including ourselves, all of humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. In other words, all people have inherent value. They're valuable for their own sake, and we should never reduce them to a mere tool that we use just to achieve our own goals and purposes. So we can translate that into more normal language and say that we should treat all persons, including ourselves, as having inherent value. A little easier to understand. Even simpler translation is don't use people. So this is not the most earth-shattering rule, right? We don't appreciate being used and we ought not to use others. But there's a qualifier here. He says this only applies to rational and autonomous people. The reason for that is you need to have rationality and autonomy in order to be held responsible for your actions and in order to be considered a moral agent. Only people with rationality and autonomy have inherent value for Kant. So if an individual does not have reason and does not have autonomy, we don't have to treat them as having inherent value. Now, there may be other reasons why we ought to be careful in how we interact with them, but it's not out of respect for their inherent value. So who's rational autonomous? This is going to lead us to the notion of Kant's moral community. So think back to that video that we did on utilitarianism, where we identified the moral community as the group of individuals whose interests you need to take into account when making a moral decision. So we had with utilitarianism a very broad definition of moral community that included all sentient creatures. In Kant's moral community, it is only rational and autonomous human beings. So it's a much smaller moral community, a smaller group of people that we need to be concerned about. Because reason and autonomy are the most important qualities that human beings possess, he says these are what make us different and distinct from animals, and it's because that's what makes us moral agents. These are the qualities that we really need to respect in other people. And the worst thing you could do would be to act in a way that took away another person's ability to make a free choice that was rational and autonomous. Okay, so who's rational autonomous? Well, you have to be human, first of all. You have to be an adult. So those of us who remember being children ourselves or who are around children a lot know that kids aren't rational up to a certain point, and children aren't able to make their own free decisions up to a certain point either. So for Kant, you definitely needed to be a human being, you definitely needed to be an adult human being, and you need to be able to reason. So there are some human adults who, due to disabilities or other factors, don't have the ability to reason, and they're not going to be within Kant's moral community. And then he says there are some individuals who are definitely not going to be considered rational or autonomous. Infants and children are obviously in this category. Now, that doesn't mean that we can treat infants and children however we want to. Kant actually says that we have a moral duty to other people in society who are rational and autonomous to treat infants and children well, to raise them well in order to produce more productive members of society. The intellectually disabled are obviously going to be out of Kant's moral community. Again, we may have other reasons, other duties to other moral agents, why we should treat individuals with intellectual disabilities well, but we don't have any duties directly to them because they themselves don't possess reason and autonomy. All non-human animals, so we don't have any duties to animals that are not human beings at all. Kant also said that women were in this category. He said that women were not rational or autonomous. The reason for this is that Kant lived at a pretty different time period. Kant was around during a time when women were not able to do much in the public realm. They were not able to take advantage of education. They were not able to hold a lot of jobs. They weren't allowed to vote. They didn't hold public office. All kinds of limitations on what women were seen to be fit to do. So what Kant thought about women was that the types of things that women were responsible for, like child rearing and maintaining the home, were things that women just naturally knew how to do. They weren't things that required reason, and they weren't things that required autonomous decision making. So for that reason, he said, women are sort of these creatures who act out of instinct and habit, and even though they're doing things that are very important, like raising children, they don't really get any moral credit for doing them well because they automatically know how to do it. So obviously today we have a very different view on that. And if you were given a case in which you were asked to analyze a woman's actions using Kantian theory, I would expect you to assume that that woman is in fact rational autonomous. So you don't get to cop out and say, oh, well, Kant didn't think women were rational autonomous, so we don't have to worry about this. So this is an interesting fact about Kant, but we're going to apply his theory as if women are just like men and are rational and autonomous. So women are now considered part of the moral community. We know that Kant's ideas were based on cultural prejudices about the genders and not on real facts about gender differences. So what does it mean to treat someone as a mere means? Basically, what you're doing when you treat someone as a tool to get what you want is you're taking away that person's ability to make a rational, autonomous decision about something. So there are a lot of ways we can do that, but what Kant was mainly focused on was ways that you could kind of manipulate another person by lying to them, by withholding information, or by coercing them in some way. Now keep in mind, we talked about coercion when we were talking about egoism and the idea that coercion can take a lot of different forms, not just physical, right? So we can emotionally manipulate people as a way of coercing them. We can apply social pressure. All of these are things that we would use to apply pressure to someone to take away their autonomy and to pressure them to make a choice that we want them to make in our own interest instead of letting them make their own free and reasoned choice. So if I lie to somebody, I'm not giving them all the true information that they need in order to make their own decision. If I withhold information from someone, I'm doing the same thing. They need this information in order to make an informed decision. If I don't give them what they need, then I'm preventing them from making a good, rational, and autonomous decision. So this is a very bad thing to do to someone, according to Kant, since our rationality and our autonomy are the most important things about humanity. So he gives us the same examples as before on 107 and 108, and instead of applying the first version of the categorical imperative that had to do with finding the maxim and seeing whether it's universalizable, in these examples now, what we're looking at is whether these are consistent with viewing people as having intrinsic value and treating them as ends rather than means. So we can return to these now and see that when a person commits suicide, they are not viewing themselves as having intrinsic value, and so we know that Kant's not going to allow this practice under either formulation of the categorical imperative. He says, in this case, you're treating yourself as a mere means, and it's therefore still never allowed. The false promise, that was the example of the person who needs a loan and they falsely promise to pay it back, even though they're never going to be able to do that. Based on what we just said, you know that this is also not going to be allowed. This uses the other person, the person with the money, as a mere means to an end, withholds information that person would need to make an informed decision. So I can still use a person to get a loan as long as I'm very honest with them and I give them all the information that they need to fully decide whether they want to give me that loan. So if I walk up to you and say, hey, I need $500 and I'm never going to be able to pay you back, would you please consider loaning me the money? That's okay to do because I haven't withheld any information from you. I'm honoring you and respecting you as someone with inherent value, and I'm letting you make a fully informed, rational decision to loan me that money knowing I'll never be able to pay you back. It only becomes a violation of this imperative if I withhold information that you need to make that informed decision. The other example we have is neglecting one's talents. This, we said before, we have an imperfect duty to cultivate some of our talents. In this case, Kant said that we also won't be respecting ourselves as an individual with inherent worth if we neglect all of our talents. So this is not going to be allowed under either formulation of the imperative. And then finally, we have the notion of charity. This is not consistent with viewing all of humanity as having intrinsic value. So when I encounter another person in need, I have to recognize that this is a human being with value and worth, and that's going to mean that I can't just disregard or ignore their needs. So we have to sometimes give to charity. So now we've seen that these four examples of suicide, false promises, neglecting our talents, and giving to charity, we can reach the same conclusion about what we ought to do by applying the first version of the categorical imperative about the maxim and the second version of the categorical imperative about treating other people as ends in themselves and never as a mere means to an end. So to put it all together, we can look at how we might apply Kant to the case of Tom and Carol. That's the case that I gave you before with utilitarianism, and that you could use to practice for writing your essay. You can also use this to practice applying Kant to a case before you have to write that essay for me for a grade. So when you do this to apply to the case of Tom and Carol, you will need to figure out what exactly Tom's dilemma is, what's the choice that he has to make. Again, don't get distracted. It's really tempting to talk about things that you think Tom did wrong in the past, but we're focused on the current decision that Tom has to make. Keep in mind that Tom has to act from a proper motive. So if he does something for the wrong reason, even though it seems consistent with what Kant would want him to do, Tom's not going to get any credit for that unless he's doing it for the right reasons. So his proper motive is to do his duty, which is to act in accordance with the moral law. How will we know whether Tom's doing that? Well, we can apply the two versions of the categorical imperative. If he does something, what would his maxim be, and can that be universally practiced? Would we want anyone to do this? And then how can he act in such a way that he's valuing other individuals as ends in themselves and not merely as a means to an end? So like I was saying earlier, we can assume that just because Carol's a woman doesn't mean that we can say that she is not a rational autonomous agent. Now, there may be some other factors that you see in that case that would lead you to question her rationality or her autonomy, but her sex should not be one of those. And then you can conclude and figure out what Kant would tell Tom to do. So like with utilitarianism, if you want to practice applying this, I'll create a practice forum for you, and I can give you feedback on that.